Good morning. This is Christopher coming at you live from the, at the moment, rather snowy Ithaca, New York, this Sunday morning. And I'm here with a webinar on two ever exciting topics, double the fun, mission optimization and testing. As you can see there are pictures of our wonderful AUV. I'm a member of CUAV, Cornell's project team, which you know if you've managed to find this webcast or find this video. But if you don't know who we are because you were just stumbling around YouTube because you had nothing better to do with your life, we're a college project team that each year builds a robotic submarine, competes in a competition down in San Diego, where we send our robotic submarine out in a pool, have it do some things, and feel good about the, 200 or so hours each of us put into it during the semester. Alrighty, so mission optimization. One can think of a mission, of course, the goal being to maximize points, but you can think of it kind of like an economic problem. So if you create, you have some sort of utility that you want to maximize, in this case, points, which is not quite correct because, of course, if you just want to win, what really matters is placement. So you just want to get more points than the next higher up person, which is a slightly different optimization problem. Because, if there's like a safer way to get enough points such that you still take first place or second place or whatever, but potentially not as many if you went for the risky option. Then if your goal is just to place higher, you want to take the safer option, even if it'll get you less points. And that's something you could do if you're interested, but that's rarely actually the case. So we just end up optimizing for points because it's a reasonable approximation. Then you have a reasonable set of constraints, primarily time. You have 15 minutes or 20 minutes, or in the case of this last year, 25 during the finals to complete the course. And you need to get as many points as possible done during that time. But that does mean that, if you could do something with 1 extra second, it doesn't actually matter because you don't have 1 extra second. It's a hard time constraint. So you can't just do some sort of continuous optimization where you choose the maximum points per unit time. You have to actually get the maximum amount of points in the time you have. Of course, the capabilities of your sub will be good at some things, bad at some things, capable of some things, and capable of other things. You want to take that into account. The ordering of tasks. Some tasks have to be done before others for point reasons. Sometimes if your sub needs to find certain tasks to localize itself to figure out where it is, you'll want to ensure that it does some tasks before other tasks so that doesn't get lost, or at the very least that it takes into account that it is more likely to get lost if it doesn't go to certain tasks. Also, simple failure chance. I guess along with submarine capabilities, your sub will probably have a high chance of succeeding at some tasks, simple tasks, maybe hitting a buoy. You're pretty good at hitting a buoy, and you could probably get around the PVC wire, the navigation task. But, bins might be a 20% chance of success. Maybe you've only hit the torpedoes once, so you don't want to do those unless you just have a lot of extra time. All things to consider. Essentially, though, you're just trying to construct a model of a mission as an economic simulation that you can maximize. So you have a utility function, you have a way to calculate how many points you'll get given some, we'll call it an execution plan. So you want to generate these execution plans, these, say orders of tasks. So you put the sub in the water and the sub's going to say, okay, I can do this. I know I can do these tasks. Now, within those tasks, let's say I can do, buoy, bins, recovery. It's an interesting set of tasks to be able to do. But anyways, let's run with it. Then how are the ways in which I can do these tasks, and how do those, look for my utility function? So I could order them in different ways. I could choose to do some and not others. Maybe I could choose to run different navigation patterns. You can sort of put any kind of permutations you want as long as they're, relevant, i.e. to points or time or any of these other constraints. And the idea is you want to sort of search that tree of possibilities, possible execution plans, like orderings of tasks. You say, I'll do, just in a very simple sense, task A, then task B, then task C, or I'll do task B, then task A, then task C, or task C, then task B, then task A, etc. And then you can go through those, and for each one, calculate what your utility result is, what the expected points you'll get in the remaining time you'll have is. And then, of course, you choose the one that gives you the maximum expected utility. Although, if you end up with ties, as you will, if you have like extra time, for example, you probably want to choose by some other factor. So if you're going to get the same amount of points, you still probably, for example, want to do the plan that takes less time, because in case you run into problems, or you get, I think, bonus points for time at the end of the mission, although it's pretty negligible. But or say if you know that one plan is safer than the other, but you didn't actually, usually you want to just account for safety, i.e. failure chance, in your point calculations. But in the case that that's not possible, you just didn't do that. If you have two plans that are equivalent points, but one of them is more likely to succeed, obviously you want to choose that one. And, you know, whatever other constraints you might have at the moment can likewise be implemented at that stage. So yeah, it's sort of glanced upon before. You have a set of possible tasks that you can do. For each task, you have a set of points. Also note that the task split works reasonably well, but what you really want is you want to choose sort of the units of execution for your mission based on what actually gives points, right? Because you want to, you know, a lot of tasks, especially the past year when some of them were fairly complicated, had multiple, you know, possible point outcomes. Like you could do, forward manipulation, where you place the pegs, had like 16 possible point permutations or something based on whether or not you placed pegs, replace them on the same hole, replace them on a different hole, just knock them off, et cetera, et cetera. And ideally, you want to consider those, you know, individually, like each peg individually, or so to speak, just so that you can choose to, for example, do just one peg if that's all you have time for, but not omit it because you didn't have time for the whole task. This can become somewhat complicated just coding-wise and architecture-wise, because even though, you know, you want to consider, for example, each peg individually, you also have to keep track of the whole peg board as you're going through the task, because you need to remember what you've already done. Otherwise, you'll just, you know, replace the same peg, which will get you no extra points. So that would be very suboptimal. So sometimes that can be challenging, and just architecture-wise, and often you do have to make compromises in the sense that, say, you choose to, you know, group, you know, ideally not, but maybe when you choose to group pegs together as one task, even though it can be split up more. This was likewise true last year with recovery, and even some other things like torpedoes. You know, you could fire technically one torpedo and still get a reduced amount of points if that was all you had time for, and that, you know, in many cases could be the optimal decision. So yes, considerations. What tasks have we done? Obviously, repeating tasks is useless. You only want to do each task once. The simplest way to simulate this is just to only create, say, plans of execution, possible orderings of tasks, in which, you know, the tasks are unique, because you don't want to assert, otherwise the space is infinite anyway. So that consideration is like easiest to enforce if you do it that way rather than some sort of filter. How likely are you to complete a task successfully? Usually you just want to implement that as multiplicative effect on the points. Like if you think of a 50% chance of succeeding in a task that gives 1,000 points, just simulate the task as having 500 points. There's no reason to actually put that in somewhere or incorporate it differently, because it literally just changes the expected points of the task. Although if you want to explicitly multiply it, so you can change that easily, that's fine too. Where are we? Travel time, you know, your sub speed. If you want to be really fancy, you can take into account acceleration. We just simulate that our sub moves at top speed all the time, but that's pretty reasonable because we can accelerate to top speed in, like, I don't know, a negligible amount of time compared to the time it takes us to cross transect, for example. But you do want to, like, when you're ordering tasks, you're going to end up with a lot of orderings that don't make geographical sense. You know, you go across the pool, then you come back, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you want to choose the ones that make the most sense, which is done naturally by simply simulating distance as travel time, because that's the constraint it actually affects, right? You know, if you want to, again, you can get as fancy as you want here. If you want to simulate the fact that traveling, you know, to certain places might give you a higher risk of getting lost, or if you end up in the middle of the bowl of Transdeck, maybe your DVL doesn't work so well there, et cetera, et cetera. But for the majority of cases, you can just simulate moving across the pool as a drain on time, is something that costs you time. And if you're optimizing for the maximum amount of points within some amount of time, and you just take into account, the time of all your tasks plus the time it will take you to move between them, you'll end up naturally falling out with, the geographically optimal ordering, where you go through the tasks in a way that makes sense, and frankly, probably the way that you would have programmed it if you weren't, dynamically optimizing, or so to speak. But this way you can still choose which task to do based on how much time you have left. And again, as touched upon before, what do we need to do in a certain order? Multi-stage tasks that need to have certain parts done before others, like recovery or whatever. Tasks that if you don't do first, you will get lost. Like we put a requirement often on doing pipes to tasks before we do the task. Pipes to the orange markers on the ground, pass segments, I guess it's sometimes been called. Just because if we don't do them, our sub's probably not going to be able to figure out where it is, because we don't have a very good, our guess of the initial layout isn't good enough to just navigate there blindly. We need to see the pipe. So the other, I guess, and perhaps most important thing here is that if you run this live, now you could just sort of compute the optimal ordering of tasks once and just do it, program that in. And in many ways, that's kind of what you do as a human when you're thinking about it. When you write your competition program, you're thinking about what can our sub do, how well can it do it, how should I order it, probably geographically. But the problem is, usually we're not very good at predicting how our sub does, and that seems to be recurrent. The situation very much changes as the mission proceeds. As your sub goes through the pool, it acquires a lot more information about what it's done, how well it's done it, etc., and it can make a better decision about what it should do now, simply because it has more information. So you want the sub itself, not some human ideally, to continuously choose the next task. You want the sub to determine, okay, well, the first, I did buoys and I got kind of stuck on buoys, and that took me 10 minutes. So now I probably should give up on bins and just go do recovery, because if I don't, I'll run out of time and end up just doing bins and not getting very many points, because, recovery is worth so much more points, etc. So, this can lead to some interesting behavior, but that's kind of the point. You don't necessarily know what your sub is going to do when you put it in the water, which I can tell you caused some significant consternation among my teammates. But that's fine, because as long as your, algorithms are reasonable, as long as you correctly simulated how many points each task gives, how long each task takes on average, what your sub's capable of, not capable of, what restrictions you need in terms of ordering, for example, you're going to end up with a correct mission path, even if it wasn't necessarily one you had explicitly considered before. But it will change based on what happens. If the sub gets stuck on something, the sub will choose, the task to give it the most points of the time remaining, which will probably mean that it'll skip some tasks. If the sub ends up with extra time, it might choose to do tasks it hadn't, previously considered. And both of these can happen within the same mission. You can have a mission which starts out with, the sub gets stuck on buoys. If we take 10 minutes on buoys, that would be horrible. But, okay, at that point we decide, well, okay, we probably should go do recovery, because, recovery, at least this past summer, was just had a ludicrous amount of points, but that made sense to do. So we say go from bins directly to recovery, but we get lucky and we get recovery done really fast. Now we have a few extra minutes. Maybe with those few extra minutes, we can go back, say, to forward manipulation, and get some extra points. So yeah, one of the really useful things is how this allows you to do is, in some ways, run missions backward. So, say if you, just in terms of points, if it makes sense to do, say, one or two things and then like the final thing, and then you end up with some extra time, as long as you do this correctly, you can go back and do other stuff and gain extra points, which is otherwise kind of hard to do, which is a very linear mission, even if you have some provision for skipping tasks. So, of course, this was indeed, as mentioned, used by CUAV the past summer to a reasonable degree of success. Although, again, recovery was just worth so many points that ended up being, as chosen by our optimal mission runner, as we so termed it, but that ended up being the choice a lot of the time, nonetheless. This is very useful, and it's useful to even if you don't want to, write this, which sometimes could be complicated, even if your task system, say, doesn't really support dynamic restarting or whatever of tasks, which I can say ours really didn't either. That was fun to write. Anyways, it's useful to think about it in the sense, and it's useful to think about it in a sort of not particularly formal, but at least mathematical. How do we maximize, the utility that we're trying to gain here, i.e., points, even just from a human's perspective, sitting down and saying, okay, well, we really realistically, it's a week before Transdeck. Some things have gone well, some things have not gone well. It's always what happens. And you want to sit down and figure out what, your sub can do, what the realistic chances of it are completing a certain task. If you only have it half the time correctly in the pool, chances are you're only going to do it a quarter of the time correctly in Transdeck. And even if that's not, say, fun to admit, it's useful to understand in constructing the mission that's going to give you the best possible chance of success. And that brings me conveniently to the next part of this webinar, testing. So I've only been to Transdeck once, but if my one visit is any indication, unfortunately, most problems at Transdeck are not conceptual. People don't run into trouble at Transdeck because they forgot to, incorporate some feature onto their sub, or because they forgot to, or because they forgot to optimize their mission, honestly, or because they, just didn't even try a task. I mean, people have problems at Transdeck because sub doesn't work. So, they've tested it in their home pool, say, a little bit, or some people test in the hotel pool at Transdeck, sometimes because they have no other option. But honestly, one part of doing well, insofar as I guess we think, is simply covering bug possibilities. Figuring out what can go wrong, how it can go wrong, as best you can before Transdeck, and trying as best you can to fix it before it does. So simply, this translates to eliminating as many potential error cases, I guess, weighted by the chance that they're likely to occur before you get to Transdeck. You want to ensure, of course, that you can complete full missions in your testing area, which simulate Transdeck to whatever extent possible. Obviously, this is very situationally limited, but even if, we're lucky enough to have a pool at Cornell where we can test, but it's nowhere near the size of Transdeck, nor, comparable in layout or whatever. So we have to set up a significantly modified course, but it is, a relatively complete course, mostly differing just by distances and location of elements, which ends up not mattering that much. So yes, you want to simulate Transdeck to whatever extent possible you can in your pool. And it helps, actually, I think, if you routinely take down and put back up your pool, because that's what happens at Transdeck. The elements get moved around, take it down and put back up, and you don't want to be extremely dependent on exact locations of elements because you cannot guarantee that. So to expand upon that, your goals are to prevent later failure, which is very broad and can be broken down into bug testing. The simple, can we do it as we have planned? That's the first step. First thing is, can we put the sub in the water in our pool at our college and run the mission? If you can't do that successfully, do that first. Once you do that, there are some more places to go, though. You want to see then, and this is where it gets fun. The figuring out how to work it, figuring out how to make it work the first time is fun too. But this is where it's like you against the sub. You can bring some of your friends over, especially if they don't like software because they think they're too nerdy or whatever, and have them suggest ways in which something could go wrong. Say, what happens if the IMU is off axis? If someone screwed it wrong, what happens if? Okay, that's unlikely, but what happens if it gets knocked or something? If your design is vulnerable to that. What happens if you have, one motor that's not working quite correctly? Simulate mechanical problems, simulate electrical problems. What happens if your batteries are low? Does your navigation change? Simulate software problems. What happens if your Kalman filter gets a little bit off, as you've noticed it do? What happens if, your vision system sees something incorrectly? Literally, yeah, to figure out what errors you think are likely, especially anything that differs from Transdeck and your local pool. Like if one of your mission elements it's a different color, obviously. Even if you can't get a mission element of the actual color, simulate your sub looking at something with that color to at least gauge whether or not your vision system can even handle it. Have your sub navigate in different ways from mission element to mission element. Don't lay out the course in the same way every time. Lay it out in different ways such that your sub has to, try various means of navigation. You want backup plans. Sometimes you're going to get to Transdeck and you just can't do tasks you could do it, your home pool. This was the case for us this past summer. We got Transdeck, and no matter how hard we tried, we really just couldn't see the torpedoes task. It was green against green. Transdeck is murky, variable lighting conditions, unlike our home pool, which was significantly clearer thanks to lots of chlorine. And we just had to give up on torpedoes for the most part because it was, we knew we just couldn't do it there. And that was one case where the ability to optimize, dynamically optimize our mission, as was covered earlier in this webinar, is exceptionally useful because you can just sort of remove a task from the list of possibilities. But even if you can't do that, you want to keep that in mind conceptually. What's your strategy for making the maximum number of points, and what happens if something just isn't going to work? What happens if one task you thought you could do, you couldn't do? What happens if some feature of your sub, just goes wrong, just doesn't work in Transdeck? How do you change? How do you, refine your strategy? And a lot of that is going to happen last minute, but to the extent to which you can at least think about it briefly and at a high level early, it can be helpful. And likewise, adaptability to different fields/layouts. This is just mostly useful in terms of testing at Transdeck. If you recall from this previous summer, there were sort of various versions of the course laid out around different points at Transdeck, just so more teams could test at once. They had one with, I think, just buoys and perhaps wire, and then another that was everything except recovery, and then the other side was, of course, the full mission layout. But you want to be able to use as many of those as possible for testing. So you can think of testing strategies for when you get to Transdeck that allow you to, say, use just the buoys if you just have the buoys. In terms of team logistics, of course, you want to have all your travel plans, but also, more importantly, how do you test? How do you test at the pool, and how do you test at Transdeck? Over the years, we've developed, I don't know if it's good, but at least a strategy for testing at Transdeck, along with our infamous software cubicles. But it's very useful to have, not only in terms of software, but in terms of team, a well-defined way to maximize the effectiveness of your testing time, especially in Transdeck, because you have very limited testing time in Transdeck, and it is worth its weight in gold, quite literally. The ability to test things at the actual place you'll be putting your sub in the water and hoping it works is invaluable, and you will not do well if you do not use it well. So you want to mainly just make sure that all the time you get is used, so that when your slot comes, you're ready, everyone works together to move the sub, move the software stuff, whatever needs to happen. And that from a high-level perspective, you choose what to do with it well. And there's an important split here. I guess I'll go ahead and go to my next slide and get to my next slide. You want to, a few things. Obviously, you want to not just quote unquote test what works, especially at Transdeck. If you know you can do buoys, you shouldn't be testing buoys, and you shouldn't be just running missions, full missions that spend the first 5 minutes doing buoys, because then you just do buoys repeatedly, which is very useless. So it's, in some of this software architecture, it's very useful to be able to just do tasks independent of the full mission, because it's far, far better to spend your 30 minutes of testing time on fixing what's broken than spend half of it on doing something you've already done already. That's rarely useful. That said, you do want to test things a few times. Working once is no guarantee that it'll work reliably. But there's a difference between that and just running the same thing over and over again, which we see sometimes, which is we found to be not helpful. I mean, if our buoys works 5 times in a row in Transdeck, we probably don't need to test it anymore. So in terms of back at school, sheer time is very important, and some of this is situational constraints when you could practice when people are free, but just having the sub in the water doing things is the best way to catch error cases. Run it through different stuff, of course. Don't just test what works. Don't just run the same thing. We spend the majority of our testing time on things that don't work, which seems obvious, and I think it is, but sometimes just architecture things could limit this, and you cannot realize it. If you just have the ability to run linear missions and can't run individual tasks, suddenly your testing is very suboptimal because you have to repeat things every time. Environmental suitability in terms of pool, I guess, as I mentioned, in terms of people's schedules. But some things you do have more control over: methodology, as mentioned, and have lots of backup plans, even if for no other reason than because crafting backup plans is a heck of a lot of fun. I've done, well. Alrighty, well, I think that gets us to questions. If anyone has any, the grand total of, quote, 0 viewers. Thanks, Google. It's very reassuring. I see at the moment. So given that, if no one has questions in a few minutes, I'll probably head out, but I'm here, and I'm also available via email at cwg46@cornell.edu. Again, that's cwg46@cornell.edu. Feel free to send me any questions about any aspect of software, although my particular expertise is focused on, as given here, mission optimization and some level of systems design, as my earlier webinar was on. Alrighty, well, that was exciting. Thank you all. I'm not sure whoever is watching this, but if someone's watching this, then Google is wrong. And so thank you for proving Google wrong. It doesn't happen often enough. When Google goes down, I check my internet connection, not Google, which is a sign that they have achieved too much of a monopoly. But I'm saying this in a Google Hangout, and they're recording it, so what am I doing? I should go before I get myself arrested by the NSA. Goodbye. Thank you.